Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Paula Agustin, and I am a sophomore at Rutgers University studying animal science on the pre-vet/research track. For my presentation, I will be talking about the adverse reciprocal health effects of watershed pollution on animals and humans. What I mean by adverse reciprocal health effects specifically is how the pollution that humans put into the river affect the health of the aquatic animal species, and how the pollution that animals put into the river affect the public health of human beings. A pertinent environmental issue in the world right now is pollution. There are many types of pollution that can be brought onto our environment, such as air pollution and water pollution. With water pollution, there are multiple methods of polluting waterways and rivers. One method that I will be discussing is the dumping of contaminants, both natural and unnatural, into the water systems. On the daily, humans and animals use the water, either to bathe ourselves, drink from it, wash our clothes, etc. Eventually, the contaminants from these instances of pollution will make their way into living bodies and either make them feel sick or change them physically. As part of my research, I sought out to learn about some of the ways these contaminants exactly affect both humans and animals. For this section of my presentation, I will be discussing some of the data that is known about the effects of human-made pollutants on the animal species residing within the water. There are a multitude of classes of pollutants being dumped into water bodies. These include, but are not limited to, toxic chemicals such as dioxins and furans, plastics, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, and natural contaminants like nitrogen and phosphorus originating from fertilizers. From a small sample of scientific papers discussing this issue, it can be known that the health effects of being exposed to harmful pollutants range from hypoxia, which is low body oxygen, due to eutrophication from fertilizer runoff, to changing an organism's metabolic pathway from birth, to metal accumulation in the skin that leads to metal poisoning. Here is a case study that I wanted to focus on because this is a unique instance of pollution that people do not typically think of. In this scientific report written by Martinez et al., the team studied the effects of a pharmaceutical drug called fluoxetine on zebrafish. If you do not know what fluoxetine is, it is a drug commonly known as Prozac used to treat various mental disorders such as depression and obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, in humans. A common way for this drug to end up in the waterways is not by dumping from a pharmaceutical manufacturer, but by humans who are prescribed to take this pill. Commonly, people who are prescribed Prozac but do not want to take it for personal reasons would flush the pills down the toilet. Through this, the pills end up in the sewer system, which have the potential to flow into the adjacent water body. This correlation of the drugs being dumped into quote-unquote wastewater effluent receiving urban streams with spiking prescription rates is highlighted in this paper. Martinez's team studied how the fluoxetine specifically affected the zebrafish and found that the pharmaceutical compound would become concentrated in the tissues of the zebrafish, as well as the gametes that get fertilized and laid externally. The exposure eventually caused increases in specific miRNAs that target the stress axis in the zebrafish eggs. As a result, the eggs had a higher chance of developing reduced levels of basal cortisol, which is a steroid hormone. On the other hand, man-made contaminants aren't the only types of pollutants in the watersheds. In this section, I will discuss what is known about the effects of natural animal contaminants on humans. The main threat to human beings from polluted watersheds is the risk of being infected with disease. With the presence of feces in a river comes the possibility of the water being infected with fecal coliform bacteria, which include pathogens, also known as disease-causing organisms. Some diseases that are caused by the fecal coliform bacteria include, but are not limited to, E. coli, cryptosporidiosis, giardiasis, and adenovirus. As with other human diseases, one may experience symptoms. Some symptoms associated with fecal coliform pathogen infections include diarrhea, vomiting, stomach cramps, and so on. In this case study that I wanted to highlight, Cox et al. Wanted to survey the levels of fecal matter in a local Australian watershed by Sydney, Australia, and obtain the certain densities of the pathogenic bacteria and microorganisms. In this chart, the group of researchers display the results of Cryptosporidium and Giardia concentrations in the watershed that they discovered, in addition to which animal species the microorganisms originate from. As you can see, common domestic animals are hosts for pathogens that may cause potential public health hazards. The sheep seem to be the more common host for Cryptosporidium, while young and old cattle seem to be the more common host for Giardia. This chart displays the results for positive samples for adenovirus, reovirus, and enterovirus. The only pathogen that poses a public health problem from this chart is reovirus, with 9 positive samples between domestic animals and the native wildlife in the area. Now, so far, I have discussed how my topic applies to animals and human beings in general. Now, I will specify how my topic relates to the Raritan watershed. Before I begin discussing the effects of pollutants on citizens and animals living in the Raritan watershed, I must give some background information on how the Raritan became polluted and filled with contaminants. As the United States expanded industrially with the Industrial Revolution, multiple factories and companies set up sites along the Raritan River. Examples of these companies include the American Cyanamid Superfund site and Sherwin-Williams. These companies were notorious for dumping their wastes into the Raritan River, including chemicals, plastics, and dyes. The areas along the river where these factories were located served as a home to many aquatic species, such as striped bass and rainbow smelt. Ultimately, these species were negatively affected and were forced to relocate. This is a quote from the Rutgers Raritan River Initiative's website. Quote, "Today, the Raritan suffers from pollutants and stormwater runoff from farms and urban development, nitrogen, phosphorus, and other discharges from wastewater treatment plants, and contamination from past and presently operating industrial facilities built along its shores. In addition to these pollutants, there are natural animal feces of the river, as well from the various animals living in and around the river. These species, as discussed before, have the potential to harbor fecal coliform bacteria, which could also serve as pathogens. If these pathogens go undetected in water treatment plants, they will be able to reach the homes of thousands of people and make people sick. One instance of this is the recent E. coli outbreak that occurred in Edison, New Jersey in October. This first article is detailing how the Edison Water Utility sent out an announcement to Edison residents about the E. coli contamination of their water system and to be wary and cautious. This second article from Patch gives advice and instructions for Edison citizens, such as boiling their tap water first before drinking it or using it to cook food. Boiling the water will kill the bacteria, thus making the water safe to use. Whether you know it or not, your actions truly can make a difference. There are many ways that one can go about improving the state of the Raritan River. One way that seems small but can ultimately have a huge impact is changing personal lifestyles to decrease pollution on the river. This includes using fewer disposable products and picking up after one's dogs when walking so that their feces does not get caught up in runoff and be disposed into the Raritan. Another course of action is to improve wastewater treatment plants and infrastructure in order to avoid public health crises from happening again. Depending on the location along the Raritan River, planting riparian buffers is beneficial in order to prevent nitrogen and phosphorus runoff from entering the river and causing eutrophication. Another method involves getting the local government officials involved by voicing your concerns about the river and how the conditions are harmful overall. For fun, you can organize a cleanup effort with some friends or colleagues to pick up trash along the coast and dispose of them properly. And speaking of groups, you can also join a group that speaks up about the Raritan River. As a leading research university, Rutgers has organized many efforts to advocate for a cleaner Raritan, as well as teaching the general public about the Raritan River and the Clean Water Act of 1972. In addition, Rutgers also offers the Johnson Family Chair for Water Resources and Water Ecology program for people interested in learning, quote-unquote, how human activities in upland watershed affect downstream aquatic ecosystems and how that knowledge can be applied to promote better stewardship of water resources. Outside of Rutgers, there are multiple watershed organizations located around the Raritan Watershed and Raritan River, such as the Lower Raritan Watershed Partnership. These organizations hold multiple programs for students as well as families, business owners, and residents of the Raritan River and Raritan Watershed, in order to teach them about the ins and outs of watershed ecology and why keeping the river clean is important. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope that you were able to learn something new today about the potential personal dangers of a polluted river and try to become more conscious of how your actions may affect other types of organisms and other human beings. If you have any further questions or comments about my presentation, or if you want to contact me, my email is pja78@scarletmail.rutgers.edu.